I was in the middle of pushing when I saw her walk into my delivery room behind my husband, Miles. Not a nurse, not a doctor, a woman I'd never seen before, with perfectly styled hair and fresh makeup, carrying two coffee cups, and looking around my birthing suite like she belonged there. Who is that? I gasped between contractions, my voice barely audible over the beeping monitors and the controlled chaos of bringing new life into the world. Miles' face went sheet white. The woman, tall, blonde, probably 10 years younger than my 34, froze in the doorway like she'd walked into the wrong movie theater. But what happened next burned itself into my memory forever. They looked at each other, and both of them started crying. Not tears of joy, not tears of overwhelm at witnessing birth, tears of pure, devastating guilt. The kind of tears that confirm your worst fears in a single, crystalline moment of understanding. Get her out, I said, my voice finding strength I didn't know I had. Get her out of here right now. Doctor. Turner looked up from between my legs, confusion creasing her brow. Abigail, you need to focus. Baby's crowning. We need another push. But I couldn't focus. I couldn't push, because the man I'd been married to for 8 years, the man whose baby was literally emerging from my body at this very moment, had just brought his girlfriend to watch our child being born. My name is Abigail Johanna Foster Morrison, and until that moment, I thought I was living in a complicated but manageable marriage. I'm a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, which means I've seen families at their most vulnerable, their most authentic. I know what love looks like, what fear looks like, what guilt looks like. And I knew, watching Miles' face crumble as this stranger backed out of my delivery room, that my life had just shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spend my days protecting other people's children, advocating for families, ensuring the most vulnerable patients receive the care they deserve. I pride myself on reading people, on spotting the warning signs of abuse, neglect, or family dysfunction. Yet here I was, sprawled in stirrups, realizing I'd been blind to the betrayal happening in my own home. Abigail, honey, push, the nurse said gently, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. Your baby needs you right now. Miles stood there like a deer in headlights, still holding his phone, still wearing that guilty expression that told me everything I needed to know. The coffee cups the woman had been carrying lay spilled across the linoleum floor, the dark liquid spreading like the stain of this moment across everything I thought I knew about my life. Are you going to explain who that was? I asked through gritted teeth, another contraction building. Abigail, I can't, not right now. The baby deserves better than this, I said. And with that anger fueling me, I pushed with everything I had. My daughter, our daughter, slipped into the world at 3:47 a.m. on October 15th, screaming and perfect and completely unaware that her first breath had been taken in a room thick with deception. They placed her on my chest, this tiny miracle with Miles's dark hair and what looked like my stubborn chin, and I felt the strangest combination of overwhelming love and complete devastation. Miles reached out tentatively, as if to touch her head, but I shifted away. Don't, I whispered. Don't you dare touch her until you tell me who that woman was. Dr. Turner was finishing up with the afterbirth, the nurses were monitoring my vitals, and Miles was standing there like a man whose world had just imploded, which, I suppose, it had. We both knew there was no coming back from this moment, no explanation that could justify bringing another woman to witness the birth of our child. Her name is Jessica, he said finally, his voice barely audible. We've been how long? The question came out flat, controlled. The voice of someone who already knew the answer would be worse than imagined. 18 months. 18 months. I did the math quickly. He'd started this affair when I was 6 months pregnant, when we were picking out cribs and arguing about baby names and planning our future as a family of 3, when I was asking him to help me paint the nursery because my back ached and I couldn't reach the corners. The baby, Lily, we'd already decided on Lily Rose, made small mewing sounds against my chest. I looked down at her perfect face and made a promise that she would never ever feel as betrayed and abandoned as I felt in that moment. 18 months, I repeated, testing the words. She's been watching you lie to me for 18 months. It's complicated, Abigail. No, I said, my voice growing stronger. It's actually very simple. You're a cheater, and she's helping you cheat, and you both thought it would be appropriate to bring your affair to our daughter's birth. Miles's face was red now, tears streaming down his cheeks. She was supposed to wait in the car. I told her to wait in the car. But she didn't, did she? She came up here with coffee for both of you, like this was some kind of celebration, like my pain was entertainment. The nurse who'd been monitoring Lily stepped closer. Mrs. Morrison, would you like us to have security escort your husband out? You have the right to decide who's present during your recovery. I looked at this nurse, Maria, her name tag read, and saw something in her eyes that told me she'd witnessed scenes like this before. Hospital staff see everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly of human nature. They know when something isn't right. Not yet, I said, surprising myself. I need him to stay long enough to explain why he thought any of this was acceptable. Miles opened his mouth, but I held up my hand. And I need him to call his girlfriend back up here so she can explain too. Abigail? No, please. Don't do this here. I didn't do this, Miles. You did this. You brought her here. You made our daughter's birth about your affair. So now we're going to deal with it right here, right now, in front of the people who helped bring our child safely into this world. Truth is, I wasn't completely surprised. I'd been feeling the distance for months, maybe longer. The late nights that couldn't be explained by his architecture firm's deadlines. The new clothes, the improved grooming, the sudden interest in working out, the way he'd started holding his phone at angles where I couldn't see the screen. The calls he'd take in the garage or the basement, claiming they were work calls but speaking in voices too soft for business. There had been the weekend in Portland that got canceled last minute because of a client emergency, except when I called his office. They said he'd taken the weekend off. The unexplained charges on our credit card to restaurants I'd never heard of, in neighborhoods we never visited. The receipt I found in his pocket for flowers I never received, with a note that said for our 1-year anniversary. I'd started paying attention then, really paying attention. Miles had always been methodical, organized, the kind of person who planned everything down to the minute. But suddenly he was forgetting conversations we'd had, mixing up dates, claiming he'd told me things he definitely hadn't. His patterns changed. His preferences shifted. He started drinking different coffee, listening to different music, using phrases that didn't sound like him. The pregnancy had been planned, wanted, celebrated. We'd tried for 2 years before I got pregnant with Lily. When those 2 pink lines finally appeared, Miles had cried with joy. He'd called his parents immediately, had taken me out for a celebration dinner, had started making lists of everything we needed to do to prepare. For the first few months, he was the perfect expectant father, reading pregnancy books, attending every appointment, asking thoughtful questions about nutrition and exercise and birthing plans. But around month 6, something shifted. He became distracted during appointments, checking his phone constantly. He started missing the little milestones. When I felt her first kick, when we found out she was a girl, when we toured the hospital. He'd claim he was busy with work, but his business partner, Mike, had mentioned that Miles seemed to be working less, not more. I started making my own quiet preparations around month 7. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, exactly, but something felt wrong. I opened my own bank account for the first time since we'd been married, transferring small amounts from our joint savings. I made copies of important documents, our marriage certificate, tax returns, insurance policies, and stored them at my sister's house. Started documenting the strange charges on our credit cards, taking photos with my phone, and saving them to a cloud account Miles didn't know about. I also started paying closer attention to his schedule, his patterns, his explanations. I bought a small notebook and wrote down every inconsistency, every time his story didn't match what I observed. I wasn't trying to catch him cheating. Exactly. I was trying to figure out what was going wrong so I could fix it. But the evidence was building towards something I didn't want to believe. The night before I went into labor, Miles had been on his phone texting someone for over an hour. When I asked who he was texting so late, he said it was Mike about a morning meeting. But Mike had been at our house for dinner just 3 days earlier, and he'd mentioned that their big project deadline wasn't until the following week. Nothing Miles said made sense anymore. When my contractions started at 1 a.m., Miles seemed almost panicked. Not the good kind of panic that comes with impending fatherhood, but the guilty panic of someone whose plans had just been disrupted. He kept checking his phone while I was timing contractions, kept stepping out to make calls he claimed were to the hospital. Now I knew he'd been calling Jessica, coordinating her presence at what should have been our private family moment. When I arrived at the hospital and got settled into the delivery room, Miles had disappeared for nearly an hour. He said he was moving the car and getting coffee, but the parking garage was a 5-minute walk and the coffee shop was in the lobby. When he came back, he had 2 cups of coffee and a story about long lines that didn't quite add up. I'd been in active labor for 6 hours when Jessica walked into my delivery room. 6 hours of Miles being distracted, stepping out for phone calls, acting like a man with divided loyalties instead of a husband whose wife was about to give birth to their first child. Looking back, I realized he'd probably been planning to have her there all along. She didn't stumble into the wrong room. She knew exactly where to find us. She'd brought coffee for both of them, which meant they'd discussed her staying, discussed her witnessing this intimate moment. The audacity of it was breathtaking. So when Miles started crying as I demanded explanations, when Jessica's tears started flowing as she backed out of my delivery room, I felt vindicated in my months of quiet observation and documentation. My instincts had been right. My preparations had been necessary. I just hadn't been prepared for the betrayal to be quite this blatant, quite this cruel. I asked Maria to call Jessica back up to the room. 20 minutes later, she returned without the coffee cups, looking like she'd been crying in the hallway. Miles stood beside my hospital bed like a man facing execution, which in a way he was. Our marriage was about to die, right there in the delivery room where our daughter had just been born. Explain, I said simply, adjusting Lily in my arms. She was sleeping now, blissfully unaware of the drama surrounding her first hour of life. Jessica looked at Miles, clearly hoping he'd take the lead, but he just stared at the floor, so she started talking, and what came out was worse than I'd imagined. They'd met at his gym 18 months ago. She was a personal trainer, recently divorced, and Miles had signed up for sessions ostensibly to get in shape for the baby. The physical relationship had started almost immediately. She knew he was married, knew I was pregnant, knew we were trying to start a family. He told me you guys were having problems, she said, her voice shaky. He said you were planning to separate after the baby was born. I looked at Miles. Did you tell her that? He nodded miserably. So for 18 months, you've been lying to both of us, telling me everything was fine, while telling her we were separating. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, I interrupted. You wanted to keep both of us, so you lied to both of us. Jessica looked stricken. I thought, he said, you knew about me, that you were okay with it because the marriage was ending anyway. The level of deception was staggering. Miles hadn't just cheated. He'd constructed an entire false reality for both of us. He'd convinced Jessica that I was a soon-to-be ex-wife who wouldn't mind sharing my husband's attention. He'd convinced me that his distance and distraction were normal pregnancy-related stress. Why did you come here tonight? I asked Jessica directly. He said you'd want me to be here, that you wanted to meet me because we'd be co-parenting with him, and it would be better to start building a relationship now. Co-parenting. He'd been planning our divorce and Lily's custody arrangement before she was even born, making promises to another woman about access to my child. And why did you both start crying when you saw me? Jessica glanced at Miles again, but he offered no help. Because, she said slowly, looking at you in that moment, seeing what was actually happening, I realized Miles had been lying to me about everything. You weren't some bitter ex-wife who didn't care about him anymore. You were a woman giving birth to the baby you both wanted. And I was the other woman interrupting the most important moment of your life. And you, Miles, why were you crying? His voice was barely a whisper. Because I knew it was over. I knew you'd never forgive me. And I knew I deserved that. I sat there for a long moment, holding our sleeping daughter, processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. Miles hadn't just had an affair. He'd been planning to leave me while I was pregnant, had been making promises about our unborn child to another woman, had been living a completely double life.
Maria, I said to the nurse.
Could you please call hospital security? I'd like Miles and Jessica to leave now. Abigail, please, Miles started, but I cut him off. You've made your choices, Miles. All of them. For 18 months, you've been making choices about our marriage, our family, our future, without including me in any of those decisions. Now I'm making some choices of my own. Miles broke down completely then, sobbing apologies and promises that we both knew were meaningless. Jessica, to her credit, looked genuinely horrified by what she'd participated in, but that didn't change the fact that she'd knowingly pursued a married man whose wife was pregnant. As security escorted them both out, I made mental notes of everything that had been said. The timeline, the lies, the future plans they'd made without my knowledge. I had a feeling I was going to need every detail in the coming weeks, but for now, I focused on Lily, on her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, on the sweet weight of her against my chest. She was the only innocent person in this entire situation, and she deserved better than parents who couldn't be in the same room without devastating each other. I had work to do. The next morning, still in my hospital bed, I made my first strategic move. I called my sister Rachel from my personal cell phone and asked her to bring me the folder of documents I'd been storing at her house. When she arrived an hour later, she took one look at my face and knew our worst fears had been confirmed. "How bad is it?" she asked, settling into the visitor's chair with Lily in her arms. "Worse than we thought. He brought his girlfriend to the delivery room, Rachel. She's been in the picture for 18 months. He's been planning to leave me since I was 6 months pregnant." Rachel, a family law attorney with 15 years of experience, immediately shifted into professional mode. "Tell me everything, and I mean everything. Don't leave out any detail, no matter how small." For the next 2 hours, I recounted not just the delivery room disaster, but all the warning signs I'd been documenting. The unexplained absences, the financial irregularities, the lies about work meetings and client dinners. Rachel took notes in her careful lawyer handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or specific incidents. "Abigail, this is actually better than I expected," she said when I finished. "Better? How is any of this better?" "Because he's been incredibly sloppy. And because you've been incredibly smart about documenting everything. Most women in your situation realize what's happening too late to build a strong case. You've been building one for months without even realizing it." Rachel explained that Miles's financial choices during the affair could be considered marital waste in Washington state. The flowers, dinners, and gifts for Jessica had been purchased with marital funds. His lies about work could potentially impact any claims about overtime or business expenses.
Sibek the polls. Sibe.
Most importantly, his admission that he'd been planning to leave during my pregnancy established a pattern of deception that would be relevant in custody proceedings. "But here's what concerns me most," Rachel continued. "The fact that he's been making promises to another woman about access to Lily suggests he doesn't understand how custody works. He can't just decide that his girlfriend gets to co-parent your child. That level of entitlement tells me we're dealing with someone who's going to fight dirty." I felt a chill at those words. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to assume Miles is going to hire aggressive counsel and try to maximize his custody time, possibly so he can play happy family with Jessica. Men who cheat during their wives' pregnancies often have distorted ideas about their parental rights." Rachel pulled out her phone and started making calls right there in my hospital room. First, she contacted a private investigator she worked with regularly, someone who specialized in documenting infidelity and hidden assets. Then she called a forensic accountant who could trace Miles's spending during the affair. Finally, she contacted her firm's best custody evaluator, someone who could assess the situation and make recommendations about Lily's best interests. "This is moving really fast," I said, feeling overwhelmed. "It has to," Rachel replied. "Miles has had 18 months to plan his exit strategy. We need to catch up quickly, and we need to assume he's going to lawyer up the moment he realizes you're serious about divorce." That afternoon, Dr. Turner cleared me for discharge. As I was getting dressed to leave the hospital, Miles called my cell phone. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message with Rachel beside me. "Abigail, please. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling. Jessica's out of the picture. I ended it last night after we left the hospital. Please don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. Think about Lily. She needs both her parents." I played the message twice, taking notes on everything he said. He ended it. Rachel asked skeptically,
Sibe. Sibe.
"But notice what's not in that message. Any actual accountability for what he did. No acknowledgement that he lied to me for 18 months. No explanation for why he thought bringing his girlfriend to Lily's birth was appropriate. Just minimization and deflection." Rachel nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like a lawyer. That's good, because we're going to need that analytical mindset for what comes next." What came next was a week of careful maneuvering. I went to stay with Rachel and her husband Mark, partly for emotional support and partly because I needed witnesses to everything Miles might do. He called constantly, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, sometimes trying to negotiate. I documented every call, every text, every voicemail. Rachel advised me not to engage beyond basic communication about Lily's needs. Meanwhile, the private investigator Rachel had hired began his work. Within 3 days, he'd confirmed that Miles and Jessica's relationship was far more serious than either of them had admitted. They'd been on weekend trips together, trips Miles had told me were work conferences. They'd looked at apartments together in a different part of Seattle. Most damaging of all, Jessica had been posting photos on her social media accounts that included Miles, often with captions about her amazing boyfriend and their future together. "Look at this," Rachel said, showing me printouts of Jessica's Instagram posts. She posted a photo of baby clothes 6 weeks ago with the caption, "Getting ready for our little one, Abigail." She was planning to help raise Lily before Lily was even born. The level of presumption was breathtaking. Not only had Miles been promising Jessica a role in our child's life, but she'd been actively preparing for it, shopping for supplies, making plans that included my unborn daughter. But here's the most interesting part, Rachel continued, pulling out another document. The investigator found an apartment application they filled out together. "Look at the date." I looked at the paperwork. Miles and Jessica had applied for a 2-bedroom apartment and been approved for a lease starting November 1st, just 2 weeks after Lily's due date. "He was planning to move in with her immediately after the baby was born," I said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why he wanted her at the hospital. He was planning to introduce her as Lily's future stepmother." "Exactly. And look at the apartment specs, 2 bedrooms, specifically requesting a child-friendly complex with a playground. They weren't just planning to live together, they were planning to have Lily for regular overnight visits." This discovery changed everything. Miles hadn't just cheated. He'd been actively planning our family's future without my input or consent. He'd been making decisions about where our daughter would live, who would help care for her, what her life would look like, all while lying to me about the state of our marriage. I called Miles that evening, the first time I'd initiated contact since leaving the hospital. "Abigail, thank God. I've been trying to reach you. How's Lily? When can I see her? We need to talk, Miles. In person, with lawyers present." There was a long pause. "Lawyers? Abigail, come on. We don't need lawyers. We can work this out ourselves." "No, we can't, because I know about the apartment. I know about the lease you and Jessica signed together. I know about her Instagram posts planning to help raise our daughter. And I know this wasn't just an affair, Miles. This was a complete betrayal of our family." Another pause, longer this time. When Miles spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more calculating. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're wrong about most of it. And if you think you're going to keep me away from my daughter, you're going to be very disappointed." "There it is," I said. "There's the real Miles. No more apologies, no more tears, just threats." "It's not a threat, Abigail. It's reality. I'm Lily's father, and I have rights. Rights that don't disappear because you're upset about Jessica." I hung up and immediately called Rachel. "He just showed his hand," I told her. "The remorseful husband act is over. Now we're dealing with the man who's been planning this for months." Rachel wasn't surprised. Men like Miles always reveal their true intentions once they realize manipulation isn't working. "The good news is that threat he just made, that's going to work in our favor when we get to court." The next day, Miles hired an attorney, not just any attorney, but one of Seattle's most aggressive divorce lawyers, someone known for taking high-conflict cases and pushing for maximum custody rights. His first move was to file for emergency custody of Lily, claiming I was being vindictive and preventing him from exercising his parental rights. "He moved fast," Rachel said, reviewing the papers. "But he also made some critical errors. Miles's emergency motion painted me as an emotional, vindictive wife who was using our daughter as a weapon against him. It claimed that my refusal to let him see Lily was psychologically damaging to both the baby and to him. It asked for immediate 50/50 custody, arguing that Lily needed both parents in her life from the beginning. What Miles's motion didn't address was why he thought bringing his girlfriend to Lily's birth was appropriate. It didn't explain the 18 months of lies. It didn't acknowledge that he'd been planning to leave during my pregnancy. Instead, it focused entirely on my post-delivery behavior, trying to frame my protective instincts as parental alienation. "This is exactly what I expected," Rachel said. "He's trying to control the narrative by making this about your reaction instead of his actions. But his timing is terrible, and his arguments are weak." Rachel filed our response 3 days later. Unlike Miles's emotional pleading, our motion was methodical and evidence-based. We included the timeline of his affair, documentation of his lies, proof of his financial waste of marital assets, and most importantly, evidence of his plan to move in with Jessica and include her in Lily's care without my knowledge or consent. We also included a detailed affidavit from me describing the delivery room incident, not as an emotional outburst, but as a factual account of what had occurred. Rachel's strategy was to let Miles' own behavior speak for itself, rather than engaging in the he said, she said arguments his attorney was trying to create. "The beautiful thing about this case," Rachel explained, "is that Miles documented his own misconduct. The apartment lease, the The social media posts, the financial records, he created a paper trail that tells the whole story. 2 weeks after Miles filed his emergency motion, we had our first court hearing. I was nervous but prepared, having spent hours with Rachel rehearsing the questions I might be asked. Miles looked confident, dressed in his best suit, sitting beside his attorney like a man who expected to win. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Foster, no relation, despite the shared surname, was known for being thorough and no nonsense. She'd reviewed all the filings before the hearing and came prepared with pointed questions for both sides. Morrison, she began, your motion requests immediate 50th custody of a newborn infant. Can you explain to me why you believe that's in the child's best interests? Miles's attorney answered for him, hitting all the standard talking points about paternal rights and the importance of both parents in a child's life. But Judge Foster wasn't interested in boilerplate arguments. I'm asking Mr. Morrison specifically, she said. Sir, can you explain to me why you brought another woman to witness your daughter's birth? Miles stammered through an explanation about wanting me to meet Jessica because we'd be co-parenting. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical as he spoke. Co-parenting, she repeated. Mr. Morrison, were you divorced at the time of your daughter's birth? No, Your Honor. Were you separated? Not officially. No. Had you discussed divorce or separation with your wife? Miles hesitated. We'd been having some difficulties. That's not what I asked. Had you explicitly discussed ending your marriage with your wife? No, Your Honor. Judge Foster made notes on her pad, then turned to Miles's attorney. Counsel, your client's motion claims that my client is being vindictive by limiting his access to the child. Can you explain how a mother refusing to allow her husband's girlfriend access to her newborn infant constitutes vindictive behavior? Miles's attorney tried to redirect the conversation back to parental rights, but Judge Foster wasn't having it. Your Honor, she said, Mr. Morrison has fundamental rights as a father that don't disappear because of marital discord. My client is simply asking for the opportunity to maintain a relationship with his daughter. A relationship that includes his girlfriend, Judge Foster asked pointedly. Not necessarily, Your Honor. That's a separate issue that can be addressed through the family court process. Judge Foster turned to Rachel. Counsel, what is your client's position regarding Mr. Morrison's access to the child? Rachel stood and delivered the response we'd practiced. Your Honor, my client has never sought to prevent Mr. Morrison from having a relationship with his daughter. What she objects to is his insistence that his girlfriend be included in that relationship without any court oversight or input from the child's mother. My client is willing to facilitate supervised visitation between Mr. Morrison and the baby, with clear boundaries about who else may be present. Supervised visitation? Miles's attorney protested. Your Honor, there's no evidence that my client poses any danger to the child. There's evidence that he poses a danger to the child's emotional well-being, Rachel replied calmly. Mr. Morrison has demonstrated a pattern of deception and poor judgment that directly impacts his ability to make appropriate decisions regarding the child's care. His insistence on including his girlfriend in parenting decisions, despite having no legal relationship to the child, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate boundaries. Judge Foster asked to see the evidence supporting our claims. Rachel presented the apartment lease, the social media posts, the financial records, and the timeline of Miles's lies. She walked through each piece of evidence methodically, building a case that Miles's behavior wasn't just morally questionable, it was legally problematic. Mr. Morrison, Judge Foster said when Rachel finished, do you dispute any of these facts? Did you sign a lease with Miss Jessica Patterson for an apartment with a November 1st move-in date? Yes, Your Honor. But did Miss Patterson post photos on social media referring to your unborn child as our little one? I don't control what she posts, Your Honor. Did you tell your wife that you were working late when you were actually with Miss Patterson? Miles's attorney jumped in. Your Honor, the details of my client's marriage are not relevant to the question of his parental rights. Judge Foster fixed him with a stern look. Counsel, when your client's pattern of deception extends to making plans for his infant daughter's future without the mother's knowledge, those details become very relevant to the question of his judgment as a parent. The hearing lasted 2 more hours, with Judge Foster asking increasingly pointed questions about Miles's decision-making, his understanding of appropriate boundaries, and his plans for including Jessica in Lily's life. By the end, it was clear that Miles's emergency motion was not going to be granted. Judge Foster's ruling was swift and decisive. Miles would be allowed supervised visitation with Lily twice a week for 2 hours each session, with visits to be supervised by a court-appointed monitor. He was explicitly prohibited from bringing Jessica or any other third parties to the visits without court approval. The visits would take place at a neutral location, not at his home or the apartment he shared with Jessica. Most importantly, Judge Foster ordered a full custody evaluation to be completed over the next 90 days, with recommendations from a child psychologist, a social worker, and a family therapist. Until that evaluation was complete, the temporary custody arrangement would remain in place.
Mr.
Morrison, Judge Foster said as she concluded the hearing, I want to be very clear about something. Your rights as a father are important and will be protected. But your daughter's well-being comes first, and that includes ensuring she grows up in an environment free from unnecessary conflict and confusion. Your decision to involve another woman in your daughter's life without any input from her mother shows a concerning lack of judgment that this court will not ignore. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, relief. Not because Miles had been punished, but because someone in authority had validated what I'd known all along, that his behavior was unacceptable, and that Lily deserved better. But the legal victory was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, during the custody evaluation process, more details emerged about the depth of Miles's deception and the extent of his plans with Jessica. The court-appointed investigator discovered that Miles had been using marital funds to pay for a storage unit where he'd been keeping furniture and baby supplies for the apartment he planned to share with Jessica. The investigator found cribs, high chairs, car seats, everything needed to care for an infant in 2 different locations. Even more disturbing, the investigator found text messages between Miles and Jessica discussing how they would handle custody schedules, what they would tell Lily about her mother when she got older, and how they planned to present themselves as Lily's real family. The messages revealed a level of entitlement and delusion that shocked even Rachel, who'd seen plenty of high-conflict custody cases. They were planning to gaslight your daughter about her own family structure, Rachel said after reviewing the messages. Miles was telling Jessica that you were an obstacle to their happiness, and Jessica was already referring to herself as Lily's bonus mom. The custody evaluator, Dr. Patricia Woolsey, conducted extensive interviews with both Miles and me, as well as observing Miles's supervised visits with Lily. Her report filed with the court in January was damning for Miles's case. Dr. Woolsey noted that Miles showed concerning patterns of boundary violations and an inability to separate his romantic relationships from his parental responsibilities. She documented his continued contact with Jessica during the evaluation period, despite court orders limiting such contact. Most significantly, she found that Miles consistently prioritized his own desires over the child's emotional needs and showed little insight into how his behavior might impact the child's future development. The report recommended that I be granted primary custody of Lily, with Miles receiving graduated visitation that could eventually include overnight visits, but only after he completed parenting classes and demonstrated an ability to maintain appropriate boundaries between his romantic and parental relationships. When we returned to court in February for the final custody hearing, Miles's attorney made one last attempt to paint me as vindictive and controlling, but Judge Foster had read Dr. Woolsey's report, had reviewed the evidence of Miles's continued poor judgment, and had observed his behavior during the court process. Morrison, she said, over the past 4 months, you've had multiple opportunities to demonstrate that you understand why your behavior was problematic and that you're committed to putting your daughter's needs first. Instead, you've continued to prioritize your relationship with Miss Patterson. You've violated court orders regarding contact with her, and you've shown little insight into how your actions have impacted your family. Judge Foster granted me primary custody of Lily, with Miles receiving supervised visitation that could progress to unsupervised visits after he completed court-ordered counseling and parenting classes. She also issued a restraining order preventing Jessica from having any contact with Lily without court approval, and ordered Miles to pay child support and cover the costs of the custody evaluation. But the most significant part of Judge Foster's ruling wasn't about custody or support. It was about accountability. Mr. Morrison, she said, your daughter is going to grow up and eventually ask questions about why her parents divorced. When that day comes, I hope you'll be able to give her an honest answer about the choices you made and the consequences of those choices, because the record of this case will be available to her when she's old enough to understand it, and she deserves to know the truth about how her family fell apart. Walking out of that final hearing, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that Lily's future was secure, sadness that Miles had chosen his path so definitively, but also something unexpected: gratitude. Gratitude that Miles had revealed his true character so clearly, so early, so completely. Because if he hadn't brought Jessica to the delivery room, if he'd been more careful about hiding his affair, if he'd waited until Lily was older to reveal his intentions, the damage could have been so much worse. His spectacular lack of judgment had actually protected us, had given me the evidence I needed to build a strong case, had shown the court exactly who he really was. 6 months after Lily's birth, I was settled into a new apartment with a secure job and a clear custody arrangement. Miles was living with Jessica, working his way through court-ordered counseling, and seeing Lily twice a week under supervised conditions. His visits were going well. He was a decent father when Jessica wasn't around to complicate things, and I hoped eventually he'd develop the insight necessary to be the father Lily deserved. Jessica, interestingly, had disappeared from social media entirely after the court proceedings. The investigator discovered that she'd broken up with Miles shortly after the final custody hearing, apparently finally understanding the extent of the chaos she'd helped create. Miles was devastated by her departure, which provided one final lesson in consequences. The woman he'd destroyed his marriage to pursue had ultimately decided he wasn't worth the drama either. But the most important change was in me. I'd discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed, had learned to trust my instincts, had built a support network that prioritized Lily's well-being above all else. I'd gone from being a woman who made excuses for her husband's suspicious behavior to being a mother who would move mountains to protect her daughter. Lily is 2 years old now, walking and talking and completely unaware of the drama that surrounded her birth. She knows she has a mama and a daddy who live in different places, and she's learned to accept the rhythms of visits and transitions with the adaptability that children possess. She's never known Jessica's name, has never been exposed to the conflict between Miles and me, has never been used as a weapon or a pawn. Miles completed his counseling and parenting classes and now has unsupervised visits every other weekend. He's learned to keep his romantic relationships separate from his parental responsibilities, though he hasn't had any serious relationships since Jessica left. We communicate cordially about Lily's needs and nothing else. He pays his child support on time and follows the custody schedule without complaint. Sometimes I think about that moment in the delivery room, about the look on Miles's face when he realized his carefully constructed double life was crumbling. I think about Jessica's tears, about the coffee cups spilling across the hospital floor, about the devastating clarity of understanding that everything I'd believed about my marriage was a lie. But mostly, I think about the promise I made to Lily in those first moments of her life, that she would never feel as betrayed and abandoned as I felt in that delivery room. It's a promise I've kept, will continue to keep, because she deserves parents who put her needs first, even when those parents can no longer put each other first. The delivery room betrayal was the end of one story, the story of a marriage built on lies and sustained by deception. But it was also the beginning of another story, the story of a mother who refused to accept less than her daughter deserved, who fought for truth and transparency, who built a stable, loving home from the wreckage of someone else's poor choices. Miles brought his girlfriend to watch our daughter being born because he thought he could manage both relationships, could keep both women happy, could have everything he wanted without consequences. Instead, he learned that some betrayals are so profound, so public, so devastating, that they burn bridges that can never be rebuilt. And I learned that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually gifts in disguise, opportunities to discover who we really are, what we're truly capable of, and what we absolutely will not tolerate. The delivery room disaster was the catalyst that transformed me from a woman who ignored red flags to a mother who would never ignore her instincts again. Lily will grow up knowing that she has a mother who fought for her from the very moment she entered the world, who never compromised on her safety or well-being, who chose difficult truths over comfortable lies. That's the legacy I want to leave her, not the story of how her parents' marriage fell apart, but the story of how her mother put her first, always and without exception. That's worth more than any marriage that was built on deception could ever have been.